Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. Tomorrow, that is the 5th of August, marks the 1-year anniversary of the revocation of Article 370 and the reorganization of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. On this occasion, The Hindu carries 3 articles on the editorial page, which includes one editorial and 2 columns, which analyze the impact of these decisions a year later. See, under Article 370 and Article 35A, J&K had been provided with a special status. This allowed Jammu and Kashmir to have its own flag, to have its own constitution, and it also granted political and administrative autonomy to the government of Jammu and Kashmir and the state legislature. It also allowed the state government and the state legislature to define the permanent residents of the state under Article 35A and subsequently provide them with special rights and privileges which otherwise is denied to outsiders. So such special provisions were provided to the state of Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 and under Article 35A by keeping in mind the difficult circumstances under which J&K became a part of the Indian Union. But over the years, critics of these provisions have argued that the special status has promoted terrorism, it has blocked development in Jammu and Kashmir, and more importantly, it has affected the complete integration of J&K with the Indian Union, thereby threatening the unity and the integrity of India. So on these grounds, last year, the Government of India decided to revoke the special status of Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 and under Article 35A. And it not only brought the special status to an end, but it also decided to reorganize the state of Jammu and Kashmir into the Union Territory of J&K and the Union Territory of Ladakh. The centre decided to revoke the special status through an executive decision instead of doing it through a constitutional amendment, and as the controversial decision was expected to create a security challenge and as it was expected to trigger massive protests and violence in J&K, the centre decided to place massive restrictions, including the suspension of a number of fundamental rights. These restrictions were brought in a few days before the special status was revoked, and as a part of these restrictions, several mainstream political leaders in Jammu and Kashmir were arrested and detained, and they were even placed under house arrest under the controversial provisions of the Public Safety Act. Along with this, internet and communication services were suspended, and large-scale restrictions on movement were placed, along with the massive mobilization of paramilitary forces. So today, a year later, The Hindu carries out an analysis of the impact of these decisions. According to this editorial, a number of these restrictions continue to remain in place even a year later, and hence it argues that the time has come to unlock and restore democratic fundamental rights in Jammu and Kashmir. The editorial says that a number of political leaders still continue to be under detention and they still continue to be placed under house arrest. It also points out that the suspension of high-speed internet and communication services has not been completely withdrawn, and the continuation of these restrictions for 1 year has had a severe impact on the aspirations of the local people and as well as on the local economy. So this being the domestic impact of these decisions, the judiciary is yet to take a look at the constitutional validity of these decisions. But in all likelihood, the judiciary is unlikely to interfere with these decisions that have been made by the executive and the parliament. Then the editorial also points out the external impact of these decisions as well. As we have discussed over the last 1 year, the suspension of a few fundamental rights in J&K and the alleged violation of human rights of the people of J&K has affected India's standing at the global level. These decisions have led to questions against India's commitment to a constitutional democracy and India's commitment to upholding democratic rights such as fundamental rights and human rights. Even though foreign governments such as the United States, European countries, Russia, etc. have referred to this as an internal matter of India, their respective legislatures, parliamentary committees, congressional and senate committees have questioned India over the alleged violation of fundamental rights and human rights, and they have expressed concern over the year-long continuation of these restrictions. Similar concerns have been raised by the United Nations, its institutions, and several other international organizations as well. A few strategic experts have even argued that the decision to reorganize Jammu and Kashmir could be one of the reasons which could have motivated China to display border aggression in the Ladakh region. So in this context, the editorial argues that the way forward for the center would be to lift all these restrictions on basic fundamental rights and restore all communication and internet services and release all the political prisoners. It is asking the center to engage with the local people of Jammu and Kashmir in order to address their genuine demands, and it is asking the government of India to restore the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir because the pride of the people has been affected, as no state has ever been downgraded to the status of a union territory. So by restoring complete statehood and by restoring political and fundamental rights and by re-establishing federalism, the center can hope to heal the emotional and psychological wounds suffered by the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and that would provide the right stage to progress towards normalcy in Jammu and Kashmir. Next, in a related column, the writer Happymon Jacob breaks the myths surrounding Article 370 and Article 35A. See, critics of these provisions, which provided special status to Jammu and Kashmir, have always argued that these special provisions have led to the promotion of terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. They have argued that these special provisions have stalled economic development, and more importantly, they have blocked the complete integration of Jammu and Kashmir with the Indian Union. The writer points out that these arguments of the critics is just a myth, and if anything, these special provisions only provided for greater flexibility and autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir with the intention of promoting its socio-economic development within the ambit of the Indian Union and within the ambit of the Indian Constitution. The writer points out that Article 370 and Article 35A were constitutional tools aimed at conflict resolution in Jammu and Kashmir, aimed at healing the wounds and complexities of history. The writer points out that Article 370 and 35A had no role in the promotion of terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, and radicalism and militancy that we have seen in Jammu and Kashmir is more a result of homegrown disaffection against the neglect of the political and economic demands of the people of Jammu and Kashmir by the center, and the exploitation of this disaffection by hostile countries such as Pakistan, which were looking to sponsor terrorism against India. The writer says that these special provisions were actually a constitutional tool through which such disaffection could be contained, leading to better integration of the conflict-hit region with the Indian Union. The writer even says that the flexibility and autonomy provided by these special provisions is what led to socio-economic development in J&K, and according to him, this is the reason why Jammu and Kashmir has a better education and healthcare infrastructure as compared to many other Indian states. Then critics of these special provisions have pointed out that Article 35A prevented outsiders from purchasing land in Jammu and Kashmir, and according to them, this was a roadblock for economic development because industries found it difficult to set up base in Jammu and Kashmir. But the writer labels this argument as a myth, and he counters the argument by stating that industrial development could not take root on a large scale in Jammu and Kashmir because of militancy and violence in the state, and not because of restrictions on the purchase of land. He points out that despite the restrictions of Article 35A, private industries could still lease the land, and public industries could always go for land acquisition, and hence the provisions of Article 35A was not a restriction on industrial development. In fact, it was designed to protect individual land rights and prevent demographic change in Jammu and Kashmir. So according to the writer, this is how these special provisions were containing disaffection in Jammu and Kashmir, and hence they were playing a role in containing terrorism and not in promoting terrorism. Critics of these special provisions have also pointed out that the special status of J&K has resulted in the unfair flow of funds from the center to Jammu and Kashmir. See, it is true that J&K used to receive a higher share of financial support from the center, but this was mainly to address the state's deficit created by paying huge salaries and pensions to its bloated bureaucracy. Apart from this compensation paid by the center to address the state's deficit, the other flow of funds were similar and proportionate as compared to the flow of funds to the other states. Apart from this, J&K used to receive a routine transfer of funds from the central divisible pool of taxes, just like any other state. And of course, upon this, J&K used to receive a higher allocation because of its status of being a special category state. But the special category status is not exclusive to Jammu and Kashmir, and it has nothing to do with Article 370 or Article 35A. Because special category status has been extended to all the states with an international border and a difficult terrain. The critics of these special provisions have always argued that the special status of J&K had become a roadblock for development, that is socio-economic development, and thereby a roadblock for conflict resolution and complete integration of J&K with India. But the writer counters this argument by stating that promoting socio-economic development alone does not resolve a conflict. That is, conflict resolution cannot be achieved just through promotion of socio-economic development. Yes, the promotion of economic activities and industrial activities is bound to create more livelihood opportunities and bring in numerous socio-economic benefits which can help address local disaffection. But to resolve such a deep-rooted complex conflict, you would need much more than just economic development, because if you study conflict resolution from anywhere in the world, you would know that conflict resolution requires the addressal of historical grievances, the acknowledgement and implementation of key political demands, the recognition of the concerns of the local people, and of course, along with this, you need socio-economic development in order to stabilize and restore normalcy to the conflict-hit region. These are the lessons that can be drawn by studying conflict resolution from any part of the world, be it the Vietnam War, be it the Israel-Palestine conflict, be it the civil war in Afghanistan, or be it the conflict in Northern Ireland. In all these conflict zones, it has been well established that if the conflict has to be resolved, you need a combination of socio-economic development along with the addressal of historical grievances and political demands. Then upon this, in Jammu and Kashmir, we witness religious radicalization as well. The radicalization of the youth is directly contributing to the rise in terrorism and militancy. And along with this, we have the external factor wherein hostile countries such as Pakistan and even China to an extent are directly interfering in the internal affairs of J&K. So the writer argues that if such a complex conflict has to be resolved, and if the conflict hit region has to be completely integrated, genuinely integrated with the Indian Union, then we need to respect the political and economic aspirations of the local people and provide them with the required flexibility and autonomy in order to help them achieve these aspirations. But instead, what we are witnessing is a stereotyping of the ordinary Kashmiri and the labeling of Kashmiris in general as anti-nationals and terrorists, and there has been very little empathy that has been shown by the rest of India towards the plight of ordinary Kashmiris. So that's the reason why the writer argues that the revocation of special status of J&K under Article 370 and 35A has undone the very basic step in conflict resolution, and contrary to the claims made by the government, there has been an uptick in violence and terror-related incidents in J&K ever since Article 370 was revoked. Next, in another related column on page number 6, the writer argues that the revocation of Article 370 and the special status of J&K has undermined federalism and inclusion. See, proponents of the revocation of special status of J&K have argued that this would result in the complete integration of J&K with the Indian Union and bring peace and stability to the region. But the writer counters them by stating that what we need is not just a physical and territorial integration of J&K with the Indian Union, but we also need an emotional integration of the local people of J&K with India. The writer says that if a conflict has to be resolved and if peace has to be brought to a conflict-hit region, then what we need is a full-fledged implementation of democratic rights and federalism. He says that the roadblock for the integration of J&K with the Indian Union, that is the emotional integration, is not Article 370 but the lack of genuine democracy. He says that time and again the central government, that is the subsequent governments, have violated democratic norms and they have repeatedly snatched away fundamental rights, leading to greater disaffection on the ground in Jammu and Kashmir. Between the 1950s and 1990s, the central government was accused of supporting a single party rule in J&K through alleged rigging and manipulation of elections. Over the last 70 odd years, the central government and its security agencies have repeatedly violated civil liberties and fundamental rights through controversial laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Public Safety Act, and with constant restriction on movement and communication. The writer says that if a large and diverse union, such as the Indian Union, needs to sustain itself, then what we need is a liberal and accommodative constitution that provides for regional autonomy, flexibility in administration, and if required, the accommodation of even a separate flag or a separate constitution in order to truly provide regional autonomy within the ambit of the Indian Union and the Indian Constitution. In fact, the Indian Constitution does have such provisions, and it is seen to be a liberal and accommodative constitution which provides for special powers and special status to a number of such regions, including the northeastern states. So the writer argues that by unilaterally taking away the special status of J&K under Article 370, the centre has weakened the Indian Union and it has diluted the principle of federalism and inclusion. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6, which deals with the social menace caused by the sale and consumption of illicit liquor or hooch. See, the consumption of illicit liquor has resulted in several human tragedies in the country, including the recent death of more than 100 people in the state of Punjab. Similar incidents have taken place in Uttar Pradesh, Assam, Karnataka, Kerala, etc. And every year, hundreds of Indians die as a result of the consumption of illicit liquor. This is a human tragedy that can be easily avoided, and the editorial correctly blames the state governments for failing to act against the production, sale and consumption of illicit liquor. It is the state governments that are responsible to prevent this tragedy because the subject of excise and law and order falls under the state jurisdiction. The excise department, which is responsible for regulating the liquor industry, has made commercially available alcohol very expensive through the imposition of irrational excise duties in order to generate more revenue for the state government. Then on the other hand, the law and order machinery, that is the police machinery and the local administration, has failed to crack down on those centers that produce and sell illicit liquor. It is rampant corruption within the police and state bureaucracy that has allowed the sale of illicit liquor, and upon this, abject poverty amongst the weaker and vulnerable communities pushes a number of people to take up alcoholism. So in such a scenario, commercially available alcohol becomes expensive and becomes unaffordable for the weaker sections. So this creates a huge black market for illicit liquor that is available at cheap prices, and this is exploited by the liquor mafias and the corrupt state bureaucracy. The illicit liquor mafia takes up the production of toxic methanol, which is cheaper and easier as compared to the safer and expensive ethanol, and the large-scale consumption of this toxic methanol results in blindness, causes tissue damage, and even results in the death of people. In many such cases of hooch-linked tragedies, it is the victims who are the sole bread earners of the family, and their deaths affects the entire family and pushes them into further poverty. So in order to tackle this social menace, state governments need to come out with a comprehensive strategy that seeks to provide both short-term and long-term solutions. As a short-term measure, state governments can ensure that the spirits that are sold legally have a lower concentration of alcohol. Then upon this, the excise department needs to put in place better quality regulation and ensure that the alcohol that is being sold is safe for human consumption. Then the excise department has to work closely with the law and order machinery, that is the police forces and the local administration, in order to track the production and sale of illicit liquor, and strict legal action needs to be taken against those who are involved in the production and sale of illicit liquor. Then as a long-term solution, the state government, especially the state health department, needs to launch a public health campaign in order to spread greater awareness and promote behavioral change amongst alcoholics. They need to be made aware of the health impact of alcohol consumption, especially the consumption of illicit liquor. Such a campaign is all the more essential when the world is battling a pandemic, because research has clearly shown that those who are addicted to alcohol have lower immunity against COVID-19. As a part of the long-term solution and as a part of the public health campaign, the government needs to tie up with community organizations, with women groups and NGOs in order to promote de-addiction amongst alcoholics by setting up rehab centers and by promoting greater awareness amongst them. Next, we have a column on page number 7, which refers to how hospitals, diagnostic centers, and other medical service providers are trying to exploit the pandemic by overcharging the patients. So the writer says that such acts of profiteering during a pandemic should be made a punishable offense under the Disaster Management Act of 2005, which has stringent provisions to tackle such violations. Currently, state governments are dealing with profiteering under the provisions of the Epidemic Diseases Act, which is a colonial era legislation. This 1897 law, which provides special powers to the state governments to tackle an epidemic, allows them to punish the violators by charging them under Section 188 of the Indian Penal Code. But the writer says that this colonial era outdated laws are not sufficient and they are not effective in deterring such hospitals and testing centers which are trying to make a profit during the pandemic. So he is calling for the introduction of a new penal provision under the Disaster Management Act, which could enable the authorities to act strictly against such hospitals and testing centers which are overcharging the patients. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. The Ministry of Defence has brought out the Draft Defence Production and Export Promotion Policy 2020. It has placed the policy in the public domain in order to receive public feedback. So this article highlights the key provisions of the Draft Defence Production and Export Promotion Policy. The main objective of this policy is to enhance the manufacturing turnover of India's domestic defence sector to $25 billion. It sets out an ambitious objective to raise Indian defence exports to $5 billion, that is in the domestic aerospace and defence industry, and it covers both defence goods and defence services. It plans to achieve these ambitious objectives by the year 2025. The Ministry of Defence has stated that the draft policy shall act as a guiding document for India's domestic defence sector in order to promote indigenous production, self-reliance, and enhance the volume of Indian defence exports. See, under the defence procurement procedure, a minimum of 60% domestic procurement has been mandated. According to data provided by the MOD, domestic defence procurement currently stands at around 70,000 crore rupees. So the draft policy has the ambition to double domestic procurement by 2025 and raise it to 1,40,000 crore rupees. The draft policy also mandates the defence attaches who have been posted to Indian missions abroad, that is in Indian embassies, high commissions and consulates, to work more proactively to engage with the foreign governments and identify their defence needs and promote suitable Indian defence products. See, Indian missions abroad have an office of the defence attaché to which officers of the Indian Armed Forces are appointed in order to promote Indian defence exports and defence cooperation with the host government. So the draft policy is calling upon the defence attachés to work more proactively with foreign governments and foreign armed forces in order to identify their defence requirements and promote suitable Indian defence products for export. The draft policy also places a responsibility on the defence public sector units to engage in export promotion campaigns abroad, and it proposes to promote Indian defence exports by making use of the line of credit facility. See, line of credit is basically a concessional loan provided by India to friendly developing and underdeveloped countries, especially in the neighborhood. India has extended such line of credits to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Afghanistan, etc. These loans extended under the line of credit facility come with concessional interest rates and a flexible time period. They are extended by India to friendly foreign countries in order to help them develop key infrastructure and as well as to meet their defense needs. So under the line of credit facility, the Indian government can request or can even mandate the foreign government to procure Indian defense products that are produced indigenously. So for this purpose, Indian defense PSUs involved in the production of indigenous defense products can push their exports by working closely with Indian defense attachés who are posted in Indian missions abroad. Then the draft policy also proposes to establish a project management unit within the Ministry of Defence in order to estimate the timelines that are needed for the development and production of critical defense technologies and also to identify their specifications and technical requirements. Now let's take up an article from page number 14. China has decided to suspend Hong Kong's extradition treaty with New Zealand. This is in response to New Zealand's decision to suspend its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. See, recently we have discussed the controversial national security law that was passed by China that extends the jurisdiction of Chinese security agencies over Hong Kong. Western governments have labeled this as an attempt to target the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong because the new national security law that applies for Hong Kong allows the Chinese security agencies to exercise jurisdiction over Hong Kong and target Hong Kong citizens and as well as the residents of Hong Kong. So in response, a number of Western governments have cancelled their extradition treaties, which basically provides for a judicial mechanism to extradite wanted individuals if they are found to be present in the other country. Earlier, Hong Kong had extradition treaties with various Western countries such as New Zealand, Canada, Britain, Australia, US, Germany, etc. So when these extradition treaties were in operation, Hong Kong could request the extradition of any wanted individual if they were found to be present in any of these countries. But now that China has extended the jurisdiction of its security agencies over Hong Kong, these countries have decided to suspend the extradition treaty, which basically provides a refuge for those individuals who are wanted by the security agencies and law enforcement machinery of Hong Kong and China. The US, in fact, had responded to the controversial national security law by suspending the special trading privileges that had been extended for Hong Kong. China, in turn, has retaliated against these measures taken by Western governments, and it has decided to suspend its extradition treaties, that is Hong Kong's extradition treaties with all these countries. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. With regard to space exploration, what does the Dragon capsule refer to? A reusable spacecraft developed by SpaceX, the Chinese rocket carrying its mission to Mars, a joint mission between NASA, ISRO and the European Space Agency to explore the Kuiper Belt, a nuclear-powered research unit installed on the International Space Station. The correct answer is option A. Dragon capsule is a reusable spacecraft that has been developed by SpaceX that was founded by Elon Musk. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 1. See, the Dragon capsule of SpaceX, which had docked earlier with the International Space Station, has brought back 2 NASA astronauts after completing their mission on the International Space Station. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Aravalli mountain range runs in a southwest direction starting near Delhi, passing through southern Haryana and Rajasthan and ends in Gujarat. The highest peak on the Aravalli range is Mount Guru Shikhar. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 3 which refers to the ecological significance of the Aravalli mountain range and how it plays a crucial role in the recharge of the groundwater table in the NCR region. The Aravalli mountain range is in news because a group of environmental activists have tied Rakis to the trees in the Aravalli range in order to highlight the environmental threat faced by Aravalli's sensitive ecosystem. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Santali language is spoken only in Odisha and Jharkhand. It is recognized as one of the scheduled languages of India under the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, the Santali language is predominantly spoken in Odisha and Jharkhand. But it is not just spoken in these 2 states, it is also spoken in parts of Assam, in parts of West Bengal, and as well as in few parts of Northeast India, such as Tripura, Mizoram, etc. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 4 that makes a reference to the Santali language in the context of implementing the multilingual education framework in the state of Odisha as mandated by the National Education Policy. Now let's take up the next question. The Good Friday Agreement is related to decolonization in South Asia, Northern Ireland peace process, withdrawal of Soviet Union from Afghanistan, Suez Canal crisis. The correct answer is option B. It is related to conflict resolution in Northern Ireland. See, between the 1960s and 1990s, Northern Ireland witnessed a violent insurgent movement. This insurgent movement was seeking to unify Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland. Because see, the sovereign government of United Kingdom is comprised of 4 countries. That includes England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, majority of the population are Catholics who identify themselves with the Republic of Ireland and not with the United Kingdom. So these Catholics of Northern Ireland, they led a Irish nationalism movement in order to liberate the Northern Ireland region from United Kingdom and unify this region with the Republic of Ireland. These Catholics were opposed by Protestants who were seen as unionists. Basically, they wanted to unify Northern Ireland with the United Kingdom. So this conflict led to a violent insurgent movement between the 1960s and 1990s, and an insurgent outfit known as the Irish Republic Army was even established by the Irish nationalists. This violent conflict came to an end in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Peace Agreement between the Irish insurgents and the UK government. John Hume, the Northern Irish politician, played a key role in the signing of the Good Friday Peace Agreement, which brought the conflict to an end, and in recognition of his services, he was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So this article on page number 14 refers to the death of John Hume. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Purchasing Managers Index or PMI is an indicator of business activity both in the manufacturing and services sector. In PMI parlance, a score above 50 means expansion, while a score below that denotes contraction. It is published in India by the NSE or the National Stock Exchange. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, so option C is the right answer. See, the Purchasing Managers Index is published in India by a data analytics firm known as IHS Markit. It is essentially a survey that is conducted amongst purchasing managers and senior executives of the corporate world in both the manufacturing and services sectors. It basically helps in identifying the extent of business activity seen in the respective sectors, and a total score of above 50 means that the sector has seen an expansion and a score below that indicates a contraction. This happens to be a key index that is keenly watched by the markets, by the government and the industry as well. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 15, the Purchasing Managers Index for the month of July indicates a fourth consecutive month of contraction for India's manufacturing sector. This drastic contraction being seen in India's manufacturing sector and as well as in the services sector is a direct result of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The leopard is listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. In India, the leopard census is conducted by the Wildlife Institute of India and the National Tiger Conservation Authority along with their quadrennial All India Tiger Estimation. Tigers are adapted to living on the edge of forests and close to human habitation, whereas the leopard is an elusive creature found only deep inside forests. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect because the third statement has just been interchanged. So the correct answer is option B, 1 and 2 only. See, tigers are elusive creatures which are found only deep inside forests, whereas leopards can be found closer to human habitation, especially along the edge of forests. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 16, the report on leopard census is likely to be brought out very soon by the Wildlife Institute of India. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. With reference to Rolat Satyagraha, which of the following statements are correct? The Rolat Act was based on the recommendations of the Sedition Committee. In Rolat Satyagraha, Gandhiji tried to use the Home Rule League. Demonstrations against the Simon Commission coincided with the Rolat Satyagraha. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, the Rolat Satyagraha took place in 1919, whereas the Simon Commission visited India in 1928. These two events were nearly a decade apart, so clearly the third statement is incorrect. Finally, let's move on to the mains practice questions. The first question: a year has passed since Article 370 and the special status of J&K was revoked. Critically evaluate its impact. The second question: production and consumption of illicit liquor has led to numerous tragedies in the country. Discuss how the menace can be curbed. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.